Let's get started. Story number 1.
The Desert Mirage Casino had stood in the Nevada wasteland for as long as anyone could remember. It wasn't flashy like the ones in Vegas, but its weathered sign and peeling paint held a certain charm for travelers on their way through the desert. The locals rarely spoke about it, and those who did never gave a straight answer. Some claimed it was a relic of the mob days, others said it was cursed, but the strangest thing about the Mirage was that it never seemed to age. The dusty exterior and flickering neon lights had remained unchanged for decades, as if frozen in time. Ethan pulled into the Mirage's empty parking lot just after midnight. His hands trembled as he cut the engine of his battered pickup. The drive had been long, and his mind was clouded with desperation. The recent string of bad luck was more than he could bear. His wife had left him, his house was on the brink of foreclosure, and his once thriving business had crumbled under the weight of debt. He had only $500 to his name, but a flyer he'd found stuck to his windshield at a gas station had promised him a night of fortune and redemption at the Desert Mirage. The interior of the casino was nothing like its decrepit exterior. The lights were dazzling, the air cool, and the atmosphere thick with the hum of slot machines and the clinking of glasses. The patrons were dressed in sharp suits and glamorous dresses as though plucked straight from the 1950s. Ethan stepped inside, and a rush of energy surged through him. This was his chance to turn it all around. "Welcome to the Mirage," said a woman in a sequined gown, her voice silky smooth. Her smile was a little too wide, her eyes a little too sharp, but Ethan was too eager to notice. She led him to the cashier, where he exchanged his $500 for a stack of chips. The weight of them in his hands gave him a strange sense of power. He wandered the casino floor, overwhelmed by the choices. The roulette wheel spun hypnotically, the dice rolled with precision, but it was a blackjack table that caught his attention. A single empty chair waited for him, and the dealer, a thin man with slicked back hair and hollow cheeks, gestured for him to sit. "Feeling lucky?" the dealer asked, his voice dry as sandpaper. Ethan nodded and placed his first bet. At first, his luck was astounding. Every hand seemed to go his way, his chip stack growing taller and taller. The other players at the table clapped him on the back, their laughter echoing unnaturally in the cavernous room. The woman in the sequined gown reappeared, offering him a drink that seemed to sparkle in the light. He drank deeply, feeling his inhibitions slip away. But as the night wore on, the room began to change. The air grew colder, the lights dimmer. The other players' faces seemed to shift and blur, their smiles too wide, their eyes dark and empty. The sounds of the casino, the clinking chips, the spinning wheels, took on a distorted, echoing quality, like a record played at the wrong speed. Ethan began to lose. His winning streak turned into a downward spiral, and no matter how much he bet, he couldn't seem to recover. His pile of chips dwindled until there was nothing left. "One more hand," he said, his voice shaking. "I just need one more hand." The dealer smiled, his teeth unnervingly sharp. "Of course, but you're out of chips, Mr. Hale." Ethan froze. "How do you know my name?" The dealer didn't answer. Instead, he gestured to the woman in the sequined gown, who appeared at Ethan's side like a shadow. She leaned down, her perfume sickly sweet, and whispered, "You can play for something else if you'd like." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, though he already felt a deep sinking dread. "You've lost your money," she said, her voice soothing but cold. "But there are other things of value. Your time, for instance, or your soul." Ethan laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing fear. "This is a joke, right?" The dealer's smile widened. "No joke, Mr. Hale. You came here to gamble. This is just the next step." Ethan pushed back from the table, his chair screeching against the floor. "I'm done. I'm leaving." "You can't leave," the woman said, her eyes gleaming like polished obsidian. "Not yet." The patrons turned to look at him then, their movements eerily synchronized. Their faces were no longer human, twisted, hollow, and skeletal. The hum of the casino grew louder, rising to a deafening roar, and Ethan's head swam with a crushing pressure. He bolted for the exit, weaving through the labyrinth of slot machines and tables, but no matter which way he turned, he found himself back at the blackjack table. The dealer was waiting, his cards fanned out like a mockery of Ethan's fear. "One last hand," he said. "If you win, you leave. If you lose, you stay." Ethan's heart pounded as he looked around, searching for a way out. But the casino had changed entirely. The walls were cracked and stained, the lights flickering weakly. The glamorous patrons were gone, replaced by shadowy figures with hollow eyes. There was no door, no windows, just an endless expanse of tables and machines. "Fine," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "One last hand." The dealer dealt the cards with unnerving precision. Ethan's hands shook as he picked them up. A king and a 7. 17. The dealer's face was unreadable as he dealt his own cards. An 8 showed their face down. "Hit or stay?" The dealer asked, his voice like a rasping wind. Ethan hesitated, his mind raced. "Stay." The dealer flipped his face-down card. A 6. 14. He drew again. A 5. 19. Ethan's chest tightened as the dealer spread his hands in mock sympathy. "A shame," he said, "but the house always wins." Before Ethan could react, the floor beneath him seemed to give way. The world around him dissolved into darkness, and he felt himself falling, endlessly falling, as the sounds of the casino faded into a low, mocking laughter. The Desert Mirage Casino still stands, a beacon of false hope in the middle of the wasteland. Travelers occasionally stop by, drawn by the promise of fortune, but many never leave. And if you listen closely on a quiet night, you might hear the faint echo of cards being shuffled and a desperate voice pleading for one more chance.
Story number 2.
Ethan leaned back in the leather chair, staring at the rows of flashing lights and spinning wheels. The Midnight Mirage Casino buzzed with a peculiar energy, a mix of exhilaration and desperation that hung heavy in the smoky air. Ethan wasn't a gambler, but he needed to get away for a night, and the allure of the Mirage seemed perfect, distracting, and anonymous. The Mirage was famous in the city, not just for its glitzy atmosphere, but for its history. Built in the 1940s, it had seen its fair share of success, scandals, and secrets. Rumors whispered about strange disappearances, unclaimed winnings, and a hidden basement no one ever dared enter. Ethan dismissed the stories as urban legends meant to add mystique to an otherwise gaudy establishment. It was nearly midnight when he first noticed the man. Dressed in an old-fashioned black suit, the stranger stood by a roulette table, staring intently at the spinning wheel. His face was pale, his expression grim, and something about him felt off. Ethan couldn't place it, but he felt a chill creep up his spine whenever he looked at the man. "Big spender?" asked a cocktail waitress, interrupting his thoughts as she set a whiskeyable in front of him. Ethan shrugged. "Not really. Just people watching." She smirked. "Then you've probably seen him already." "Who?" She tilted her head toward the roulette table. "The guy in the suit. They call him Mr. Black. You're not the first to notice him." "What's his deal?" Ethan asked, his curiosity piqued. The waitress hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "People say he's been coming here for decades. Always at the same table, always betting on black. But here's the weird part. No one remembers him leaving. He's just there. And his bets, they always win." Ethan laughed nervously. "That sounds like a good way to keep people hooked." She leaned in closer. "I'm serious. Ask the regulars. They'll tell you. But if I were you, I'd keep my distance. There's something wrong with him." With that, she disappeared into the crowd, leaving Ethan unsettled. He looked back toward the roulette table, but Mr. Black was gone. Shaking off the eerie feeling, Ethan decided to play a few hands of blackjack to distract himself. He wasn't much of a gambler, but luck seemed to be on his side that night. Hand after hand, he won, racking up chips faster than he could believe. It was exhilarating, and for a while he forgot all about the man in the suit, until he saw him again. This time, Mr. Black was standing at the edge of the blackjack table, watching Ethan with an intensity that made his skin crawl. His pale lips curled into a faint smile, but his eyes were devoid of warmth. Ethan's winning streak faltered. His hands grew clammy, his focus shattered. He lost one hand, then another. The dealer gave him a sympathetic look as his pile of chips dwindled. "Maybe it's time to call it a night," the dealer suggested. Ethan nodded, gathering what little he had left. As he stood to leave, Mr. Black moved closer, blocking his path. "Leaving so soon?" the man asked, his voice low and smooth like a whisper in the dark. Ethan swallowed hard. "Yeah, I think I've had enough for tonight." Mr. Black smiled wider, revealing teeth that seemed unnaturally sharp. "Luck can be a fickle thing, can it? But perhaps I could help you." Ethan hesitated. "I'm not interested, thanks." "Oh, but I think you are," Mr. Black said, his voice dripping with certainty. He leaned in closer, and Ethan could feel the cold radiating from him. "One more bet, that's all, and I guarantee you'll win." Despite every instinct telling him to walk away, Ethan found himself nodding. They returned to the roulette table, where Mr. Ha. Black placed a single black chip in Ethan's hand. "Bet on black," he said. Ethan hesitated, then placed the chip on the table. The wheel spun, the ball bouncing across the numbers. Time seemed to stretch, the world slowing as the ball clicked into its final resting place. Black. Cheers erupted from the surrounding crowd as the dealer pushed a massive stack of chips toward Ethan. He couldn't believe it. He'd just won more money than he'd ever dreamed of. But when he turned to thank Mr. Black, the man was gone. Feeling a mix of relief and unease, Ethan cashed out his winnings and hurried toward the exit. As he passed through the casino's grand doors, he felt a strange weight lift from his shoulders. He told himself it was over, just a weird night that he'd laugh about later. But the nightmare was only beginning. The next day, Ethan woke to find the black chip from the roulette table sitting on his nightstand. He was certain he hadn't brought it home, but there it was, cold and heavy in his hand. Throughout the day, strange things kept happening. Shadows moved where there shouldn't have been any. Whispers echoed in empty rooms, and no matter where he went, he felt like he was being watched. That night, he dreamt of the casino. In the dream, he was back at the roulette table, surrounded by faceless figures. Mr. Black stood across from him, his grin wider than ever. "Another bet?" the man asked. Ethan tried to refuse, but his hands moved on their own, placing the black chip on the table. The wheel spun faster and faster until it blurred into darkness. When he woke, the chip was on his pillow. Desperate to rid himself of the cursed thing, Ethan drove back to the casino. The Mirage was eerily empty, the usual crowds replaced by a suffocating silence. He found his way to the roulette table, where Mr. Black was waiting. "You can't leave," the man said, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. "Not until the debt is paid." Ethan's breath hitched. "What debt?" Mr. Black leaned closer, his eyes gleaming like polished obsidian. "The price of luck. You gambled with more than money, Ethan, and now you belong to me." Ethan tried to run, but the casino twisted around him, its walls shifting like a maze. No matter where he turned, Mr. Black was there, his grin growing wider with every step. The last thing Ethan saw was the spinning roulette wheel, the ball clattering to a stop. Black, the end.
Story number 3.
The lights of the Stardust Casino glimmered like diamonds scattered across the desert, a beacon of indulgence and illusion amidst the barren Nevada landscape. Lisa, a waitress who had worked there for nearly a decade, knew every inch of the casino floor. The sticky carpet, the endless slot machines, and the smell of stale smoke that seemed to cling to her uniform no matter how often she washed it. Yet, for all her familiarity, there was one place that unsettled her: the storied poker room in the back. Rumors swirled around the poker room like cigarette smoke. Dealers whispered about a mysterious man who sometimes appeared at the high-stakes table after midnight. They called him the Shadow Gambler, a nickname that sounded more like a gimmick than a real legend. He always wore a dark suit, his face obscured by the brim of a fedora. Players who sat with him either won big or lost everything, but none could remember much about the game itself. It was as if time and memory folded in on themselves when he was present. Lisa never believed in ghosts, but the poker room had a way of unsettling even the most skeptical. It was always colder there, even when the air conditioning was off. The lights flickered unpredictably, and the surveillance cameras seemed to malfunction whenever they were pointed toward the corner table where the Shadow Gambler was said to appear. One slow Tuesday night, Lisa was sent to cover the poker room after the usual server called out sick. The room was quieter than usual, with only a handful of players hunched over their cards. The familiar sounds of chips clinking and low murmurs filled the space. As she served drinks, Lisa felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, like someone was watching her. She turned, but the corner table was empty. Hours passed, and the crowd thinned. By midnight, the room was nearly deserted. Lisa was wiping down the bar when she noticed him, a man in a dark suit seated at the corner table. She hadn't seen him walk in. His posture was unnaturally still, his head tilted slightly downward so that the brim of his hat cast his face in shadow. Despite her unease, Lisa approached him with a smile, her tray balanced on one hand. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. The man didn't respond. Instead, he lifted a hand and gestured to the seat across from him. His fingers were long and pale, the nails unnaturally clean, like porcelain. Lisa hesitated, glancing toward the security cameras, but the feed light blinked off and on, indicating another malfunction. "I'm just the waitress," she said nervously. "I don't play." He said nothing, but slid a single poker chip across the table toward her. It was black and worn, the edges chipped as if it had passed through countless hands. Engraved on its surface were the words, "One last hand." Lisa's pulse quickened. "I really can't," she stammered. "I'm working." The man finally tilted his head upward, and Lisa's breath caught in her throat. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and hollow, as though he hadn't slept in years. His mouth curved into a faint, unnatural smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sit," he said, his voice low and resonant, echoing as if coming from far away. Against her better judgment, Lisa slid into the chair across from him. The moment she did, the air around her grew heavy, and the sounds of the casino faded into a muffled hum. The man dealt the cards with an unsettling precision, his movements fluid yet mechanical. They played in silence. Lisa wasn't sure how she knew the rules or even what game they were playing, but her hands moved automatically, her decisions feeling less like choices and more like inevitabilities. As the game progressed, she felt as if her very essence was being weighed, measured, and judged. The first hand, she won. The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too many. He dealt again. The second hand, she lost. The lights flickered, and a cold draft swept through the room. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, their movements independent of their sources. By the third hand, Lisa felt a growing dread, as if something precious was slipping away from her with each card she played. She looked down at her hands and gasped. Her fingers were growing translucent, her skin fading to reveal the veins and bones beneath. "What's happening to me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man didn't answer. He simply dealt the final hand, his movements deliberate. Lisa hesitated, gripping the cards so tightly her nails dug into the edges. She could feel the weight of the moment, the understanding that this hand would determine everything. She laid down her cards, a full house. Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. The man's smile stretched unnaturally wide as he revealed his hand. 4 aces. The room grew unbearably cold, and Lisa felt her body seize as the shadows around her coiled tighter. Her vision blurred, and the last thing she saw was the man's hat tipping forward, shrouding his expression as the world went dark. When Lisa didn't return to the bar, her manager went looking for her. The poker room was empty, save for a single black poker chip sitting on the corner table. No one ever saw Lisa again. The chip was placed in the casino's Lost and Found, where it remained for years untouched. Every so often, a dealer or a patron would claim to see a woman in a waitress uniform wandering the poker room, her figure faint and flickering like a faulty hologram. Her eyes would lock onto theirs, pleading silently, before she vanished into the shadows. No one dared to sit at the corner table after that, not even the bravest of gamblers.
Story number 4.
The Cloverleaf Casino was a towering relic of the past, a monument to opulence that had faded over the years into a dimly lit maze of flashing lights and outdated decor. Locals said it had seen its share of triumphs, scandals, and heartbreak. But beneath the surface, whispered rumors spoke of something far darker. Tina, a single mother, had been working the late-night shifts as a blackjack dealer for 6 months. The job was exhausting, but the pay kept the lights on at home. She had grown used to the strange energy of the casino, the desperation on gamblers' faces, the drunken brawls, and the occasional eccentric who claimed they could beat the house. What Tina could never get used to, however, was the Gold Room. Located on the 2nd floor, the Gold Room was reserved for high-stakes players, though it rarely saw action these days. Most gamblers avoided it, claiming the room had a bad vibe. Staff joked that it was haunted, but Tina had heard enough unsettling stories from her coworkers to take the warnings seriously. One night, the casino was unusually quiet. The graveyard shift dragged on as the hours ticked closer to 2 a.m. Tina was stationed at her usual table when her manager Victor approached her. "Gold Room needs coverage," he said. "High Roller just requested a private game. You're up." Tina hesitated. I thought no one used that room anymore. Victor shrugged, his tone clipped. Guy's loaded, wants to play blackjack, just keep it professional. Reluctantly, Tina made her way upstairs. The gold room was dimly lit, its once luxurious decor now faded and dusty. A single table stood in the center, illuminated by a chandelier that flickered slightly. Seated at the table was a man in a sharp gray suit. He looked like he had stepped out of a 1940s film noir, slicked back hair, a thin mustache, and an unsettlingly calm demeanor. Good evening, he said, his voice smooth and cold. Tina forced a smile as she took her place at the table. Welcome to the gold room. Shall we begin? The man nodded, sliding a thick stack of $100 bills across the table. Tina started dealing. At first, the game was uneventful, but there was something about the man that unnerved her. He didn't fidget, didn't speak unless necessary. His eyes were piercing, never leaving hers. As the game progressed, Tina noticed strange things. The air felt colder than it should have, and the chandelier's flickering grew more pronounced. She brushed it off as her imagination, but then she realized something even stranger. The man never lost. Hand after hand, he beat the house. Blackjack after blackjack, his pile of chips grew larger. Tina's stomach churned. She'd dealt thousands of games in her career, and while luck was part of it, this was impossible. Your luck's impressive, she said, trying to keep her tone light. The man smiled faintly. Luck has nothing to do with it. His words sent a chill down her spine. Tina glanced at the security camera in the corner, hoping someone was watching. But when she looked back at the man, his smile had grown wider, more sinister. You don't recognize me, do you? He asked. Tina blinked, confused. Should I? He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. I've been here before, long before your time. Her hands trembled as she shuffled the cards. I'm just here to deal, she said, her voice shaky. The man chuckled, the sound low and hollow. Do you know what happened in this room, Tina? She froze. Her name. She hadn't told him her name. He continued, ignoring her growing fear. This was my table. Decades ago. I played here every night, chasing the dream, thinking the next hand would change my life, and then one night I bet everything. My house, my savings, my life. I lost it all. Tina swallowed hard, her throat dry. She wanted to leave, to run downstairs and quit on the spot, but she was rooted in place. They found me here the next morning, he said, his tone almost amused. I'd put a bullet in my head, right there in that chair. Her breath caught. She looked at the chair he gestured to and noticed something she hadn't before. A faint, dark stain on the faded green felt of the table. You don't believe me, he said, leaning back. That's fine. But tell me, Tina, how much do you think your soul is worth? Her heart pounded. I don't know what kind of sick joke this is, but before she could finish, the lights in the room went out. Total darkness enveloped her, and the sound of the man's voice echoed unnaturally around her. Play one last hand with me, Tina. Just one. If you win, you walk out of here and never see me again. If you lose... His voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. The lights flickered back on, and he was staring at her, his smile gone. His eyes were black voids, empty and consuming. Tina's hands shook as she shuffled the cards. She knew she should refuse, should run, but something beyond fear compelled her to stay. She dealt the cards, her vision blurring as the room seemed to tilt around her. The man didn't even look at his hand. He simply stared at her, waiting. Tina's hand was a 20. She breathed a small sigh of relief. Stay, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man flipped his cards over. Blackjack. The chandelier above them shattered, sending shards of glass raining down. Tina screamed, shielding her face, but when she looked back, the man was gone. The table was empty, save for a single chip sitting where he had been. Tina stumbled out of the gold room, trembling and pale. She tried to tell Victor what had happened, but he waved her off. No one's been in the gold room all night, he said. She stared at him in disbelief. But the man, the game, Victor frowned. The cameras don't show anyone in there, Tina. Maybe you need a break. She didn't argue. She grabbed her things and left, vowing never to return to the Cloverleaf Casino. The next morning, news spread that the casino's security guard had been found dead near the gold room. His face was frozen in a look of pure terror, and clutched in his hand was a black poker chip engraved with the words, "One last hand." Story the end.
Story number 5.
The Neon Oasis Casino had stood in the heart of the Las Vegas Strip since the 1960s. It was a sprawling, glittering beacon that attracted tourists and gamblers from all over the world. But among the employees and locals, it had another reputation, one not found in brochures or promotional ads. People whispered about the Lucky Floor, a section of the casino where strange things happened. It was said that if you gambled there at the right time, you might win big, but you'd lose something far more valuable in return. Elliot had been a blackjack dealer at the Neon Oasis for nearly 10 years. He wasn't superstitious and didn't believe in ghost stories. He chalked up the rumors to bored employees and over-imaginative tourists. But that changed one quiet Wednesday night. It was late, around 3 a.m., when Elliot was assigned to a blackjack table on the Lucky Floor. Business had slowed to a crawl, and the casino had an eerie stillness that only came during the graveyard shift. As he shuffled the cards, he noticed a man approach the table. The man was tall, dressed in a vintage gray suit with a fedora tilted low over his face. Something about his presence immediately set Elliot on edge, though he couldn't pinpoint why. "Mind dealing me in?" the man asked, his voice smooth but oddly flat like a radio broadcast from another era. "Sure thing," Elliot said, masking his unease with a professional smile. He dealt the cards, watching the man place a stack of $100 chips on the table. The man played in silence, his movements deliberate, his gaze never leaving the cards. Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The chips the man used weren't standard issue. They were older, worn, with an intricate design Elliot didn't recognize. He made a mental note to ask about them later. As the game progressed, the man began to win. Consistently, impossibly. No matter what Elliot dealt, the man always came out ahead. Other players drifted over, drawn by the streak of luck, but none stayed for long. They complained about feeling cold or claimed they saw shadows moving in the corners of their vision. By the time the man had amassed a small mountain of chips, Elliot's unease had turned into full-blown dread. "You're having quite a night," he said, forcing a smile. The man looked up for the first time, and Elliot's blood ran cold. His eyes were dark, so dark they seemed almost black, and his expression was devoid of emotion. "Luck is a funny thing," the man said. "It always comes with a cost." Elliot swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Before he could say anything, the man pushed his entire stack of chips forward. "All in," he said. The move drew gasps from the few remaining players. Elliot hesitated, his hands trembling as he dealt the final cards. The man revealed a perfect 21, another win. He leaned back in his chair, his thin smile never reaching his eyes. "You should walk away," the man said, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. "Before it's too late." "What do you mean?" Elliot asked, his voice barely audible. The man stood, gathering his chips. "This place takes more than money. You'll see." He tipped his fedora and walked away, disappearing into the shadows at the edge of the casino floor. Elliot sat frozen, staring at the empty chair. A chill ran down his spine, and he realized the air around the table had grown unnaturally cold. He glanced at the chips left behind, but when he reached for them, his hand passed right through. They weren't real. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Elliot couldn't shake the encounter, and when his shift ended, he headed straight to the security office. He asked to review the footage from the Lucky Floor, desperate to prove to himself that the man was real. The grainy black and white video showed Elliot dealing cards to an empty table. There was no sign of the man in the gray suit, no stack of chips, no other players. It was just Elliot, shuffling and talking to thin air. "What's going on?" Elliot demanded, his voice shaking. The security guard shrugged, clearly unnerved. "You're not the first to see him," the guard said. "We call him the Phantom Gambler. He's been around since the 60s, always shows up on the Lucky Floor, always wins, and then he's gone. Some say he's a ghost, others think he's something worse." Elliot didn't sleep that day. The man's hollow gaze and cryptic warning played over and over in his mind. He considered quitting, but he needed the job. He told himself it was a one-time event, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But over the next few weeks, things only got stranger. Elliot began noticing cold spots around the casino, even in crowded areas. He'd catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that disappeared when he turned to look. His coworkers noticed the change in him, too. He became jumpy, paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder. One night, while walking to his car after his shift, Elliot heard footsteps behind him. He turned, but the parking lot was empty. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until he broke into a sprint, diving into his car and locking the doors. In the rearview mirror, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the lot, the man in the gray suit, his face partially obscured by shadows. Elliot never returned to the Neon Oasis after that night. He packed up and moved out of state, leaving Las Vegas behind. But the Phantom Gambler wasn't done with him. No matter where Elliot went, he would find reminders. A single old-fashioned poker chip left on his kitchen counter, the faint scent of cigarette smoke in his empty apartment, or a shadow lingering in the corner of his vision. The Neon Oasis continued to operate, its bright lights and lively atmosphere masking the darkness lurking within. Those who dared to gamble on the lucky floor often walked away with tales of sudden chills, strange winnings, and an unshakable sense of being watched. And while the Phantom Gambler was rarely seen, his presence was always felt, a constant reminder that in the Neon Oasis, the house didn't just win, it owned you.
Story number 6.
The Desert Sky Casino had a history almost as long as the town of Oakhurst itself. At first glance, it seemed like any other casino. Flashing lights, a constant hum of excitement, the smell of stale cigarettes in the air, and the sound of clinking coins and rolling dice. But over the years, rumors began to circulate about strange occurrences within the casino's walls. They were always vague, but a few whispers from longtime locals seemed to confirm that the Desert Sky had something that other casinos didn't. Something darker. Ryan, a trucker who'd been passing through Oakhurst on his route, had never paid attention to the gossip. He was a man of reason, and to him, superstition had no place in his life. He was just looking for a place to rest, maybe play a few rounds of poker and grab a bite to eat before hitting the road again. So when he rolled into the Desert Sky one chilly autumn evening, he thought little of the strange reputation that preceded it. He parked his truck in the lot, which, like the casino itself, looked worn but still standing strong against time. The outside was illuminated by a series of neon lights that flickered as though tired from years of use. The casino's sign read, "Welcome to Desert Sky. Your luck awaits." Ryan figured that was as good an omen as any. Inside, the casino had the usual vibe. Shiny slot machines lined the walls, poker tables filled with players huddled together in quiet concentration, and a row of blackjack tables with eager dealers waiting for new victims. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, and the buzz of activity was contagious. Ryan didn't waste any time. He exchanged a couple of $100 at the cashier and moved toward a poker table. It didn't take long for him to settle in with a few other players. There was an older man with a scruffy beard who barely spoke, a young woman who was too focused on her phone to pay attention to the game, and a man in a suit who seemed to be playing to pass the time rather than actually try to win. Ryan had played poker enough to know when someone was bluffing, but the older man was a tough one. His poker face never cracked, and he played his cards with unnerving precision. As the night wore on, Ryan couldn't help but notice something strange. The casino, though full of people, was eerily quiet. There were no loud conversations, no laughter echoing in the background, just the occasional shuffle of cards and the clink of chips. The older man seemed to be the only one really focused on the game, but even he was oddly calm, his eyes never straying from his hand. The feeling of unease crept up on Ryan, and he shifted in his seat. It was too quiet, and there was something off about the way the clock above the bar seemed to tick just a little too slowly, as if time itself had been stretched out unnaturally. He looked around, but everyone else appeared to be just as absorbed in their games as they had been when he'd arrived. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Ryan caught something that made his skin crawl. A woman, dressed in black, was standing near the entrance, staring straight at him. Her hair was dark and long, hanging loosely around her face, and her eyes were empty, like two voids. Her presence felt wrong, like she didn't belong. Ryan quickly turned his attention back to his cards, but when he glanced up again, she was gone. He shook his head. Maybe it was just the low light playing tricks on him. He wasn't the type to let his mind wander, but something about the place felt off. The air was too still, too thick. The next hand came, and Ryan focused back on the game. He played carefully, but his concentration kept slipping. His mind kept returning to the strange woman he had seen, and the more he thought about it, the less he was sure of what he had actually seen. Was she just a figment of his imagination, or was there something more sinister at play? It was the next round when things started to take a truly unsettling turn. As the dealer dealt the cards, Ryan felt a chill in the air, so sharp and sudden that he shivered involuntarily. The older man across from him hadn't moved, his expression blank as always, but something about his eyes, the way they locked onto Ryan's, made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "You're not really here," the old man muttered, his voice low and hoarse. Ryan blinked, confused. "What?" The old man didn't repeat himself. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gnarled hands playing with the chips in front of him. "You won't leave here the same," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "None of us ever do." Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the sound of chips clinking loudly interrupted him. He turned to see the woman in black standing next to him now, her face inches from his. Her eyes were vacant, hollow. "You don't belong here," she whispered, her breath cold against his skin. Ryan recoiled in shock, but when he looked around, no one else seemed to notice. The room continued as if nothing had happened. The dealer shuffled the cards, the other players kept their eyes on their hands, and the hum of the casino continued. "You're still here," the woman said, her lips curling into a ghostly smile. "You're part of it now." Ryan pushed back from the table, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get out of here. He didn't know why, but something was wrong, so terribly wrong. He stood up quickly, his chair scraping the floor as he backed away from the table. As he turned to leave, he realized that the casino had changed. The door to the outside was no longer visible. The walls had closed in, and the lights were dimmer, casting long shadows across the floor. The once bustling casino was now eerily quiet, almost as if it were empty. The woman's voice echoed behind him. "You'll never leave." Ryan turned, but the woman in black was gone. Instead, the older man with the scruffy beard stood at the far end of the room, his eyes locked onto Ryan's. "Time to pay the price," the man said, his voice devoid of emotion. Ryan ran then. He sprinted through the casino, ducking behind slot machines and poker tables, but the doors still weren't there. The walls closed in, and the eerie silence grew louder. It was like he was trapped in a nightmare, unable to escape. Finally, with his breath coming in short gasps, Ryan found himself back at the poker table. His chips were gone. The dealer's cold, lifeless eyes stared back at him. "You played too long," the dealer whispered, as the room seemed to close around him. "You're ours now." The last thing Ryan saw before everything went black was the face of the woman in black, standing just behind him, her eyes as empty as the grave. The Desert Sky Casino still stands on the edge of Oakhurst, its flashing lights a beacon to travelers passing through. But those who know the truth never stop there. And for those who do, it's said that they often leave with a blank stare in their eyes, as if they've seen something they can't forget and something they can't leave behind. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The Grand Mirage Casino was a sprawling labyrinth of neon lights and endless noise, built on the edge of a forgotten desert town. Its glittering exterior promised fortune, but anyone who stayed long enough knew it was more about taking than giving. It had been open for decades, surviving recessions and rumors of mob ties, but one thing about it was consistent. Strange things always happened in the Red Velvet Lounge. The lounge was on the casino's lower level, tucked away from the main floor. Once a glamorous high-stakes room, it had been largely abandoned due to its reputation. Staff whispered about cold spots, flickering lights, and the faint scent of cigar smoke that hung in the air, despite smoking being banned for years. Players reported feeling watched, and dealers claimed their cards sometimes moved on their own. Management dismissed it as superstitious nonsense, but the stories persisted. Jackie was a floor manager, someone who prided herself on being level-headed. She'd been with the casino for years and had heard all the tales. To her, the stories were just a way for employees to entertain themselves during slow shifts. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses, until the night she volunteered to cover the lounge. It was late, around 2 a.m., when the call came over the radio. A guest wanted to play in the Red Velvet Lounge, and no one else was available. Jackie sighed, grabbing her clipboard and heading down the dimly lit stairs. She found a single player waiting at the corner table, a man dressed sharply in a three-piece suit that seemed out of place in the modern casino. "Good evening," she said, her professional tone masking her unease. "I'll be managing the floor tonight. Can I get a dealer for you?" The man looked up, and Jackie froze. His face was pale, almost waxy, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through her. He smiled, a thin, unsettling curve of his lips. "No need," he said, his voice smooth but oddly detached. "I prefer to play alone." Jackie hesitated. That wasn't how the casino worked, but something about his presence made it impossible to argue. She nodded and stepped back, watching as he placed a single black poker chip on the table. The chip didn't look like the standard casino issue. It was older, worn, with an intricate design etched into its surface. "Would you care to join me?" he asked, gesturing to the seat across from him. Jackie forced a polite smile. "I don't play while on duty, sir." The man's smile widened. "That's a shame. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." Ignoring the shiver running down her spine, Jackie turned to leave, but the lights in the room flickered, and the air grew colder. She glanced back at the man, who was now shuffling an old, battered deck of cards. "Stay," he said, his tone commanding but calm, "just for a few hands." Against her better judgment, Jackie sat down. Her radio crackled with static before going silent, leaving them in an eerie stillness. The man dealt the cards with a precision that felt mechanical, almost inhuman. The first hand was uneventful. Jackie didn't even know why she was playing, but something about the man's gaze kept her in place. The second hand, however, was different. As he flipped over his cards, she noticed something strange. The numbers and suits seemed to shift and blur, almost as if they were alive. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. The man leaned forward, his hollow eyes locking onto hers. "A game of chance," he said, "but here, the stakes are higher than you realize." The room grew colder, and Jackie felt a pressure in her chest, as if the air itself were weighing her down. She glanced at the exit, but her legs refused to move. "Let's raise the stakes," the man said, his smile now unnatural, stretching wider than it should have been. He placed another black chip on the table. "One more hand. If you win, you leave with everything you've ever wanted. If you lose..." His words hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Jackie's mind raced. She wanted to run, to scream, but some invisible force kept her glued to her seat. She nodded, her hands trembling as she picked up her cards. The final hand felt like it lasted an eternity. Each card seemed heavier than the last, their edges cutting into her fingers. When it was time to reveal, she flipped her cards over. 21. Blackjack. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. The man didn't react. Instead, he flipped his cards over with deliberate slowness. A perfect 21. "It's a tie," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally in the empty room. "But ties are rare here. Rare indeed." The lights in the room dimmed until they were barely flickering. Jackie's chest tightened as the man stood, his figure towering over her. Shadows seemed to stretch and twist around him, swallowing the corners of the room. "Thank you for playing," he said, his voice now a deep, distorted growl. "You'll be seeing me again." The room went dark. When the lights flickered back on, Jackie was alone. The table was empty, save for the single black poker chip sitting where the man had been. She grabbed it, her hands shaking, and bolted upstairs. Back on the main floor, everything looked normal, but something felt off. Her coworkers stared at her as she stumbled toward the manager's office, her face pale and her breath shallow. "Jackie?" one of the dealers called out. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She pushed open the door to the office and froze. Sitting on the desk was another black poker chip, identical to the one in her hand. Jackie quit the next day, leaving the casino and the town behind. But the nightmares followed her. Every night she dreamed of the red velvet lounge and the man with the hollow eyes. And every morning she woke to find a black poker chip on her nightstand, no matter where she hid it. The Grand Mirage Casino eventually shut down, its reputation tarnished by whispers of disappearances and deaths. The building was demolished, but locals swore they could still hear the faint sound of shuffling cards on quiet desert nights. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The Silver Crescent Casino had always been an alluring beacon in the middle of nowhere. Situated just off an old highway that seemed to stretch endlessly into the desert, The casino offered travelers a chance to escape the monotony of their journeys, to feel the rush of chance, and maybe even to win a fortune. But locals knew better. Rumors swirled about the casino's dark past, though no one ever seemed to agree on the details. Some spoke of a deadly fire in the 1950s, others of mob ties and secret burials, but one thing was certain: people disappeared there. Marcus had heard none of these rumors. He was just a man down on his luck. His wife had left, his bills were piling up, and his truck was on its last legs. The glowing neon sign of the Silver Crescent felt like a lifeline as he drove past it one evening, his gas gauge teetering dangerously close to empty. He pulled into the parking lot, which was surprisingly full for such a remote place. The building gleamed under the moonlight, its silver facade reflecting an eerie glow. Inside, the casino buzzed with life. Slot machines chimed, cards slapped against green felt tables, and the air with cigarette smoke and desperation. Marcus felt an odd chill as he stepped inside, as though the temperature had dropped several degrees. Shaking it off, he exchanged his last $50 for chips and made his way to the blackjack table. The dealer was a tall, pale man with a fixed smile that never reached his eyes. Marcus sat across from him, joined by two other players, a woman in a shimmering red dress and an older man with a fedora pulled low over his face. They played in silence, like the only sounds the clatter of chips and the occasional murmur of hit or stay. At first, Marcus's luck seemed to turn. He doubled his 50 in just a few hands, then tripled it. The woman in red smiled at him, her lipstick a vibrant slash of crimson against her pale skin. "You're on a roll," she said, her voice soft and lilting. Marcus nodded, grinning. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. But as the night wore on, something began to feel off. The air grew colder with each passing hour, and a strange pressure built in his chest, as though the room itself were closing in. The dealer never blinked, his movements mechanical, almost inhuman. The other players' expressions remained unnervingly static, their smiles frozen in place. And then Marcus noticed something truly unsettling. The clock on the wall above the bar. It was stuck at 2:17. No matter how many hands they played, how many drinks the waitress served, or how many cigarettes were smoked, time refused to move forward. He tried to brush it off, but the unease gnawed at him. Finally, he turned to the woman in red. "What time is it, really? My phone's dead." She tilted her head, her smile widening. "Time doesn't matter here, darling. Just keep playing." A sudden burst of laughter erupted from the other side of the room, but when Marcus turned to look, the source was nowhere to be seen. The slot machines flashed and chimed, but no one sat at them. The crowd that had seemed so lively when he arrived now felt like an illusion, a blur of indistinct faces that barely moved, their outlines shimmering like a mirage. "I think I need to cash out," Marcus muttered, pushing back from the table. The dealer's fixed smile faltered for the first time. "Are you sure? You've been quite lucky tonight. Perhaps you should press it further." "No, Marcus stopped mid-sentence as he glanced at his chip stack. It was gone. Every single chip had vanished, leaving the green felt bare before him. He stared at the empty space, his heart pounding. "Where's my money?" The dealer's smile returned, wider this time, his teeth unnervingly white. "Perhaps you already spent it." The woman in red laughed, a sound so sharp and brittle it made Marcus wince. "You can't leave yet," she said, her eyes glinting with something that wasn't quite human. "The night's just beginning." Panic surged through Marcus as he stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He stumbled back, only to realize that the other players were no longer at the table. The entire room had changed. The walls were darker, the lights dimmer. The hum of the slot machines had morphed into a low, droning moan that seemed to vibrate in his skull. The faces around him were no longer blurred but grotesque, their skin gray and sagging, their hollow eyes fixed on him. He turned and ran, his boots echoing loudly against the marble floor. But no matter how far he ran, the exit never appeared. The front doors, the ones he had walked through just hours earlier, were gone, replaced by a solid wall of cracked, blood-red wallpaper. "Help!" he shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. He spun in circles, his breathing ragged, until a soft whisper reached his ears. "You can't leave." He froze. The voice was right behind him. Slowly, he turned, expecting to see the woman in red or the dealer. but there was no one. Just a shadow, a tall, shifting mass of darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolence. It stretched toward him, and Marcus felt an icy grip around his throat. "You gambled more than money," the shadow hissed, its voice like dry leaves scraping against concrete. "And now you belong to us." Marcus tried to scream, but the sound caught in his throat as the shadow enveloped him. The cold was unbearable, seeping into his bones, his very soul. He fought against it, clawing at the darkness, but it was futile. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the clock on the wall, still frozen at 2:17. The next morning, a group of travelers pulled into the parking lot of the Silver Crescent Casino, only to find it abandoned. The once bright neon sign was shattered, its pieces scattered across the cracked pavement. The doors were boarded up and the windows were thick with grime. Yet as they stood there, debating whether to explore, one of them swore they heard the faint, haunting sound of slot machines chiming from within. "Must be the wind," one of them muttered, but none of them dared to go inside. Back on the old highway, a faded billboard loomed in the distance. It read, "Welcome to the Silver Crescent Casino, where fortunes are won and lost forever." Story, the end.
Story number 9.
The Desert Mirage Casino was an anomaly in the middle of the Nevada desert, miles from the glitz and glamour of Las Vegas. Unlike the Strip's neon-lit monoliths, the Mirage was smaller, older, and carried with it an air of something forgotten. Travelers sometimes stumbled upon it by accident, its glowing sign visible off the dark highway. That's exactly how Nina found herself there one late October night. She'd been driving to Reno, alone, to meet friends for a weekend getaway. A wrong turn and a dead cell signal left her hopelessly lost, her gas tank hovering near empty. When she saw the flickering red and gold lights of the Mirage in the distance, it felt like a lifeline. She could fill up her tank, maybe grab a bite, and be back on her way. Stepping inside, Nina was greeted by the smell of stale smoke, the jangle of slot machines, and a wave of warm air that was uncomfortably stifling. The casino was crowded, but it didn't feel lively. The patrons were quiet, their faces pale and drawn. Nobody seemed to talk or laugh. They just played, feeding coins and chips into machines and onto tables like clockwork. The receptionist at the front desk pointed her to the diner, tucked into the back of the casino. Nina noticed that the woman didn't make eye contact when she spoke. Shrugging off her unease, Nina headed toward the diner, passing rows of roulette wheels, card tables, and flashing screens. She felt a strange heaviness settle over her, but she couldn't explain why. The diner was just as dated as the rest of the casino, with cracked vinyl booths and faded menus. Nina ordered a sandwich and coffee from the waiter, a wiry man with hollow eyes and a forced smile. As she waited for her food, she noticed an old woman at the counter staring at her. The woman was dressed in a tattered black gown, her hair pinned up in a way that reminded Nina of an old photograph. When their eyes met, the old woman's lips moved silently, as though she were whispering to herself. Nina looked away, her discomfort growing. After finishing her meal, Nina wandered back into the casino. She didn't have much money, but the idea of playing a few hands of blackjack or spinning the slots intrigued her. She approached a blackjack table where a dealer, a middle-aged man with a sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes, was shuffling cards. "Buy-in is $10, he said with a polite smile. Nina handed over a crisp bill and took a seat. There were two other players at the table, a heavy-set man who looked perpetually nervous and a young woman with dark circles under her eyes. The game began, and to Nina's surprise, her luck was incredible. Hand after hand, she won, doubling her small buy-in in less than 20 minutes. "You've got the touch," the dealer said, his smile widening. Nina laughed nervously, brushing off his comment. But as the game continued, she noticed something strange. The other players didn't react when they lost. They didn't smile when they won. They barely blinked. It was as if they were there out of obligation rather than enjoyment. And then there was the music, or lack thereof. Most casinos blared upbeat tunes or lounge-style instrumentals. But here, the only sound was the mechanical hum of the slot machines and the occasional clatter of dice. The silence pressed in on Nina, making her feel claustrophobic. She glanced at the heavy-set man beside her, hoping for some small talk to ease her nerves. But when she looked closer, her breath caught in her throat. His hands, gripping his cards, were pale and mottled with blue veins. His fingernails were dark, almost black, as though he were suffering from some terrible illness. He turned to her, his lips parting in a half smile, and she noticed his teeth were chipped and yellowed. "You're doing well," he rasped, his voice barely audible. Nina forced a smile and nodded, her pulse quickening. She decided it was time to cash out and leave. "Last hand," she said to the dealer. He nodded, dealing the cards with a practiced flick of his wrist. Nina won again, pushing her total to nearly $300. She thanked the dealer and stood, scooping up her winnings. As she turned to leave, the dealer spoke again, his tone more urgent. "Careful out there," he said. Nina frowned, unsure how to respond. She nodded awkwardly and made her way toward the cashier's booth to exchange her chips for cash. But as she walked, the air around her seemed to thicken. The lights dimmed slightly, and the noise of the casino grew muffled. She passed by a mirror on the wall and froze. Her reflection wasn't hers. The face staring back at her was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and her skin ashen. Her lips moved, but she couldn't hear what the reflection was saying. "Miss?" The voice snapped her back to reality. A cashier, a middle-aged woman with an exhausted expression, was staring at her from behind the counter. Nina approached, handing over her chips with trembling hands. "Are you all right?" the cashier asked. "Yeah," Nina lied. "Just tired." The woman gave her a skeptical look but said nothing more. Nina took her cash and practically ran for the exit. The night air hit her like a slap, cool and sharp against her flushed skin. She hurried to her car, her heart pounding. Sliding into the driver's seat, she locked the doors and started the engine, eager to put as much distance between herself and the mirage as possible. As she pulled onto the highway, she glanced in the rearview mirror and screamed. In the back seat, the old woman from the diner sat silently, her hollow eyes locked on Nina. The car swerved wildly as Nina lost control, the tires skidding on the asphalt. She fought to regain control, slamming on the brakes. When the car came to a screeching halt, she spun around to face the back seat. It was empty. Breathing heavily, Nina gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She sat there for a long moment, trying to calm herself. Finally, she convinced herself that it was her imagination, a trick of her overstressed mind. But as she drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't left the mirage behind. The next morning, Nina stopped at a gas station to refuel. As she reached into her bag for her wallet, her fingers brushed against something unfamiliar. She pulled it out, a single black poker chip with the Mirage's logo etched into it. Her blood ran cold. She hadn't taken any chips with her when she cashed out. She was sure of it, and then she heard it, a faint whisper coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Come back," it said. "The house always wins." Nina dropped the chip, her heart pounding as she looked around. The whispering stopped, and the chip lay still on the asphalt. But even as she drove away, she knew it wasn't over. Story, the end.
Story number 10.
The Desert Mirage Casino had been a bright jewel in the Nevada desert since the 1950s, its neon sign glowing against the pitch-black sky for miles. Over the years, it had seen its share of gamblers, gangsters, and thrill-seekers. But it was the casino's history of mysterious disappearances that made locals whisper. People vanished, employees, gamblers, even tourists, always without a trace. Security footage would show them walking into the casino but never leaving. The cases were quietly swept under the rug, and the Mirage continued its business as usual. Samantha had recently taken a job as a cocktail waitress at the Mirage. She didn't believe in ghosts or cursed places. She just needed the paycheck. After a messy divorce, this job was her chance to start over. The late shifts were grueling, but the tips were good, and she thought she could handle anything until her fourth night on the job. It started like any other night. The casino floor buzzed with activity, slot machines dinging, chips clinking, and the low murmur of gamblers. Around midnight, Samantha was sent to deliver drinks to a section of the casino she hadn't worked in before, the old high-stakes room. It had been shut down years ago, but management recently reopened it for exclusive VIPs. When Samantha arrived, the room was empty except for a single man seated at one of the poker tables. He wore a black suit with a tie that seemed slightly too thin, as if it belonged to another era. His slicked-back hair glinted under the dim chandelier, and a cigarette smoldered between his fingers. "Your drink," Samantha said, setting the glass of whiskey on the table. The man didn't acknowledge her. He stared at the deck of cards in front of him as though lost in thought. "Sir?" she prompted. Finally, he looked up, and Samantha felt an involuntary shiver. His eyes were dark, almost black, and his face was unnervingly pale. "Stay for a game," he said softly. Samantha smiled awkwardly. "I'm just here to work." The man tilted his head. "One game? You'll want to hear what I have to say." Samantha hesitated. Something about his tone made her stomach twist, but she also felt inexplicably drawn to him. Against her better judgment, she sat across from him. "Just one game," she said firmly. The man dealt the cards with an eerie precision, his movements smooth and deliberate. As they played, he began to speak. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked. "Not really," Samantha replied, her eyes on her cards. "I believe we make our own choices." The man chuckled, a low, chilling sound. "That's what I thought once, but this place has a way of proving otherwise." "What do you mean?" Samantha asked. He leaned back, his hollow gaze locking onto hers. "I used to sit where you are, dealing cards. Back in 1958, this casino was new then, full of life and promise. I thought it was my ticket to fortune." His voice dropped, almost a whisper. "But the Mirage doesn't just take money, it takes people." Samantha froze. "What are you talking about? You've heard the stories, haven't you? People disappearing, always here, always at night. The Mirage demands sacrifices." He gestured around the room. "And this place, the high-stakes room, is where it began." Samantha's throat tightened. "That's just a myth, something to scare tourists." The man smiled faintly. "Is it? Then tell me why you're here." "To deliver drinks," she said, her voice wavering. He shook his head. "No. Why are you here? What led you to this place, to this moment?" She opened her mouth to answer but stopped. She thought of her divorce, her desperate need for a fresh start, her willingness to take any job that would pay the bills. The words caught in her throat. The man dealt another hand, his movements faster now. The room seemed colder, the air heavier. "One more question," he said. "If you knew the truth, would you leave?" "Yes," she said, though she wasn't sure if it was true. The man's smile vanished, and his eyes darkened further. "Then you've already made your choice." The chandelier flickered, casting shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. Samantha looked around, panic rising in her chest. "What's happening?" The man leaned forward, his voice now a rasp. "You're part of the game now. The Mirage doesn't let go. Not of me. Not of you. Not of anyone." Samantha bolted from the chair, knocking it over as she scrambled for the door. But the room wasn't the same. The exit was gone, replaced by a wall of mirrored glass that reflected her terrified face. Behind her, the man remained seated, his expression calm. "You can't leave," he said simply. "Not until the house decides." She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "What do you want from me?" "It's not me," he replied, his voice echoing unnaturally. "It's the Mirage, and it's already made its choice." The room grew darker, the shadows swallowing the corners and creeping toward her. She screamed, banging on the mirrored wall, but her reflection only stared back, her terror mirrored in its eyes. The man stood slowly, his figure dissolving into the darkness as he whispered, "Welcome to the Mirage." When Samantha didn't show up for her shift the next night, her coworkers assumed she had quit without notice. Her manager was annoyed, but not surprised. People walked out all the time. It wasn't until they checked the security footage that things got strange. The cameras showed Samantha walking into the high-stakes room but never coming out. The footage glitched for several minutes, and when it resumed, the room was empty. Her belongings were still in her locker, untouched. A week later, a new waitress took over Samantha's shift. On her first night, she delivered drinks to the high-stakes room. When she returned, she asked the bartender, "Who's the guy in the suit sitting in the corner? He wanted me to play cards with him." The bartender froze. "There's no one in that room." The waitress frowned. "But I saw him. He even talked about someone named Samantha." The bartender shook his head. "Don't go back there," he said quietly. "No one ever does." The Desert Mirage Casino remained open, its lights glowing defiantly against the desert sky. But those who worked there knew the truth. The casino had a hunger, and once it chose you, there was no escape. Story the end.